Q is on the internet. It first started on 4chan, then on 8kun. And when I was looking at it from an objective perspective, what I saw was that Q was asking people questions, not giving them answers. What does the Mockingbird media do? This is what happens. This is what it means. Giving people answers, neurolinguistically programming people. How do you dissolve neurolinguistic programming? How do you dissolve subconscious programming? You ask questions.
Isn't that convenient, though? Because if you're asking questions, you can never be proven wrong. Right. If I make a prediction and I say so-and-so is going to win the election, and then so-and-so doesn't win the election, then I look like I don't know what I'm talking about. But if someone calling himself Q just asks questions, then he can always sort of seem like he's right. It's like Nostradamus or something, right? Nostradamus writes in these riddles, and so now later on, we can look back in hindsight and say, oh, well, he was really predicting this event or that event, but maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. He was speaking in such an ambiguous way that his predictions could refer to almost anything.
Right.
But that's the objection of it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and you're right to a certain extent. However, this is how I came to these conclusions, that this is a psychological operation by the highest levels of military intelligence and the intelligence community.
That Q itself. So Q is this person who's posting questions.
I don't think it's a person. I think it's a group.
So Q is a group that's posting questions on fora like 4chan or this other
one. Yeah.
8kun. And you're saying that is a psyop from the highest levels of government.
Or I would say most likely highest levels of the military.
Okay.
Because military intelligence and the intelligence community tend to work together.
Sure.
Now, what led me to that conclusion is the numerical code in the Q drops themselves and the gap code between the time that Trump would tweet something and Q would do a Q drop and what is called the Q clock. Okay, so if you look into cryptology and encrypting information, then you will see that what the Q drops were doing was very, very similar to the way military intelligence communicates. And this is how it is that you're able to communicate a message in plain sight without the enemy knowing what exactly it is that you're saying, because it's all encrypted, it's all encoded. Now, the numerical code, if you look at the numerical code and then you line that up with certain other, and you learn the numerical code, you can line it up in a way where these numbers end up creating a much larger message. And it's the same thing with the Q clock. The Q clock is like a regular clock with 12 numbers, right? But above each of the numbers are dates. And each of these dates are different. Now, when you align all of these dates together and then you get all the Q drops that were on that day, then it creates a much larger message that is very interconnected with each other. But each of these dates, each of these drops is on a different day. So it's about spreading out this much larger message that when you put it together, put the puzzle together properly, the message becomes clear. So it's equivalent to military intelligence dumping a massive puzzle on the table of the internet and saying, figure it out.
Why are they doing this?
So that's a great question. How do you dissolve mass formation hypnosis? You have to get at least 5% or more of the population to reject the programming, the hypnosis, the narrative, right? How you get people to de-neurolinguistically program themselves. You ask them questions and then they do their own research, right? And then they come to the conclusions on their own. You can't just tell somebody the government's corrupt. You have to show them. And do you know who Yuri Bezmenov is?
Yes.
Okay.
So a Soviet guy.
Yes, and he was a KGB operative in charge of psychological warfare, what they called ideological subversion, right? So think about this. Yuri Bezmenov said that the Soviets and the global communist conspiracy, which he said is very real, okay, and he would know, they infiltrate countries, in particular, he was talking about the United States, but all countries through a ideological warfare campaign, a psychological warfare campaign that is broken down into 4 parts. Demoralization, which takes a full generation, infiltrate the entertainment, infiltrate the schools, the colleges, infiltrate governments, infiltrate the media outlets, etc. Okay? Then indoctrinate or demoralize a whole generation of children. Then, after that, you get destabilization. Now, what ends up happening there is that once that whole generation has been demoralized, then you use the infiltrators that did the demoralization in conjunction with the demoralized generation. And then they destabilize the system. And that takes a couple of years. Then once the system has been destabilized, that's when you get into the third part, crisis. So then this collapse of the supply chain, the failing of banks, the housing market crash, et cetera, et cetera. These are the crises that occur, right? Then the last part is normalization. And what happens is that during the crisis portion, these infiltrators that did the demoralization, destabilization, they move into positions of power, high-level positions of power. Then they normalize all of this stuff and they create a communist government, okay? So how does this relate to Q?
Yeah.
Right? How this relates to Q is this. There are entities within our government, within what some people would call the deep state, okay? The bureaucracy, the intelligence apparatus, military intelligence, that do not want to see the United States of America fall. They do not want a new world order, one world government. They do not want these less than 1%ers dictating our lives and the lives of our children. So the Q operation was done so that this demoralized population, which Yuri Bezmenov said, you could show people in black and white the truth and they won't believe it because they're so heavily demoralized. You could take them to the concentration camps and they will not believe it until they're behind the gates, right? How do you deprogram people? You give them questions, they do their own research, they come to their own conclusions, and they see the government corruption on their own. They see the fences. They see the gates. And they realize the system, then what they have been told is for their security is actually for their enslavement or their imprisonment. And all it takes is 5%, right? So we have in the United States far more than 5% who can see through the BS.
Yeah,
right?
Certainly. I mean, if you're defining that as people who know that the media and the government lie to us all the time, I was probably like 65%. It seems like a lot of people.
Yes.
And that's been true for a while, I think.
Yes.
So why do we need Q?
Well, what are the things, and this is also important to understand about psychological warfare operations or psychological operations. The three main things that Q was talking about and that I think are the most important are the fiat debt-based currency and the Fed, okay? Number two, the child trafficking, human trafficking networks, the slave trade, right? Number three, the government corruption and how it's rooted in these things and how the government is using its monopoly on the initiation of force to enforce this new world order, one world government and subjugate anybody that's going to dissent.